Who will win the Snooker World Championship Part 2? Now, if you missed Part 1 that came out a couple of days ago, the purpose of these two videos is to look at the players seeded between 1 and 16 in the world, the guaranteed seeds to be at the Crucible this year. I'm looking at their season so far, I'm looking at their World Championship history, and ultimately I'm trying to rank on a scale of 0 to 10 their chances of winning the World Championship this season, in my opinion. Now, in Part 1, we looked at those players seeded between 16 and 9. So in this one, we're going to be looking at the top 8. And arguably, a winner is likely to come from these 8 players. So we're just going to go straight into it. At number 8, Shaun Murphy, 8th in the world. And on the back of one of his best ever seasons last campaign, where he won 2 titles and got to another final, Shaun did look to be continuing that form straight away by winning the first tournament of the season last summer at the Championship League. Since then though, Shaun has failed to get to a quarterfinal of any ranking event, and at invitational events he has only reached 1 quarterfinal, and that was at the Champion of Champions, and he did get to the semi-final at the Masters as well. But after the highs of last year, this represents a fairly disappointing return for the magician, who sits just 22nd on the 1-year list. And then looking at his overall World Championship form, Shaun is a man who either blows very, very hot or just barely gets going. There is never really an in-between with Shaun. Since winning the world title back in 2005 as a 22-year-old, Shaun has gone on to reach another 3 world finals in 2009, 2015 and 2021, losing to Higgins, Bingham and Selby respectively. And which, look, is a very strong record, it has to be said. However, in that same time period, he has also lost in the first round 6 times, including in the past 2 years, and he's lost in the second round a further 4 times. And with this kind of record, Shaun is arguably the most likely of the top players to either lose first round or win the whole thing. It can be impossible to know with Shaun. But one thing I typically find about Shaun though is he is not necessarily a man that needs to be in good form to play well in a tournament. He's always been quite streaky, and if he gets his tail up, he becomes someone who is almost impossible to stop, especially when his long game is firing. And for that reason, I do always consider him to be, a huge threat. Of course he is. And as I mentioned, reaching 4 world finals is no mean feat. Okay, he's only won 1 of them, but to reach 4 finals and another semi-final is a fantastic record. Personally, I do fancy a few other players slightly more than Shaun this year, but he's definitely not to be underestimated. So for me, he gets a 7 out of 10. At number 7 in the seeds, we've got Junhui, and Ding for me is playing some of his best snooker in recent years, certainly since pre-COVID times. If we discount the win that he had at the 6 Red World Championships last year, Ding's last title actually came at the 2019 UK Championship. But this season he has begun to start knocking on the door of some trophies more regularly. This season has seen Ding get to 2 finals at the UK Championship and the World Open. He's also got to another semi-final and a further 4 quarterfinals to his name. And the good news for the large contingent of Ding Junhui fans has to be that he must go into Sheffield probably the most confident he's been in quite some time. However, Ding's problems at the Crucible are well documented. After making his debut in 2007, Ding has made it back to the Worlds every year since, and will be making his 18th consecutive appearance this year. However, from the previous 17 appearances, he just has 1 world final to his name back in 2016, and obviously that was a tournament that he had to qualify for. In addition to that, he made the semis in 2011 and 2017, but those remain his only appearances at the one-table setup. And perhaps a further concern is that he's not made it to the quarterfinals since 2018, and he's lost in the first round in the previous 3 years. So this kind of hoodoo that the Crucible has over Ding is just continuing. And whilst I have a feeling many of you viewers who are of a generation perhaps before me will disagree with, I firmly am of the view that Ding is the best player to have never won a world title. Having won a total of 23 professional tournaments, including 3 UK titles and a Masters crown, it would be a real shame if he never adds a world Championship to his CV as well. With all that said, I do think Ding could play a bigger part in this tournament this year than he has before. However, an issue I've kind of picked up on when watching Ding recently is when he's faced with pressure pots, Ding's cue action becomes very jabby. It's always been more compact, but it's usually quite smooth. But if he needs to play a shot with power, or he's faced with a pressure shot, it gets very twitchy and it gets very jabby. And that causes him to miss more of the big pots than he gets. And look, if you want to be a world champion, you're going to face a large volume of the big shots. And I'm not quite convinced he'll be able to keep knocking them in. And ultimately, I'd be very happy to see him do it. But for me, Ding gets, I don't think, any higher than a 5 out of 10 this year. At number 6 in the world, we've got Mark Williams, a man who will be buoyed by his recent win at the Tour Championships a couple of weeks ago. And after that, Mark Williams must come into the showpiece event with renewed hope of getting a 4th world title. And as mentioned by basically everyone in the snooker world, Mark's win at that Tour Championship was one of the finest displays of the season, and further evidence that his ability to blow away the big players with his laid-back, floating style is not going anywhere anytime soon. Willow also won the British Open at the start of the season, and he reached another final at the Championship League a couple of weeks before that as well. And whilst the middle of the campaign was a little bit hit and miss for Mark, 2 titles represents a very impressive return, especially for a man who is soon approaching 50. At his sort of world championship profile, he's a 3-time former world champion. He's also reached another final in 1999, as well as 3 further semi-final appearances. Making his debut in 1997, Williams hasn't been ever present at the World Championship since. In part 1, I talked about John Higgins, a man that made his debut in 1995 and has played at the Crucible every year since. Mark Williams has missed a couple of campaigns in 2014 and 2017, and that was kind of during a period where it kind of felt like Mark's best days might have been behind him. But just like Ronnie, just like John, that class of 92, he continues to refuse to go away. And you feel like his longevity is in part thanks to his ultra-relaxed mindset that he's always been blessed with. And I personally think that he was probably the best player of the championship back in 2022, when he lost out in the semi-finals to Judd Trump in that classic decider. But as always, with the World Championship, it's not necessarily the best player who wins the tournament. Rather, it's the man who can minimise the effect of their bad days, their bad sessions. But that Tour Championship win has really put a spanner in the works here, because Mark Williams, okay, you're never going to discount him, but he wasn't really a player I was highly fancying for the World Championship this season. And then he goes and produces that just a few weeks before the showpiece. And it's impossible to ignore how good he was and the timing of that win. So for me, Mark going for a number 4, that's an 8 out of 10. Now, from a 3-time former world champion, we've got a 4-time world champion, the 5th seed Mark Selby. And is Mark Selby the hardest player to decide on this year? This season started so promisingly for Mark. In his first 3 tournaments, he went semi-final, semi-final, final. But things after that have gone rather downhill from the point onwards. Selby's only trophy this season came at the Championship League, and that was the Championship League in its original format, not the full ranking event version of the summer. And the kind of tournament where it's really, this might sound harsh, but it's basically just a glorified practice session for the players. So, he's won it, beat some very good players, of course, but I wouldn't exactly call it, a massive title. And, if we take that away, there's not really been a lot to shout about for Mark Selby this season. He looks like he might have been back to somewhere near his best when he dismantled O'Sullivan 6-0 at the Players' Championships quarterfinals, but then he followed that up with a loss to Zhang Anda. And his last match before the World Championship was a 10-8 loss to Gary Wilson at the quarterfinals of the Tour Championship. where he commented that if he plays like that at the Crucible, then he might as well not bother with the sport anymore. Obviously, comments made in the heat of the moment, but comments that do signal that his confidence in his game is very fragile at the moment. However, you don't need me to tell you what Selby is like at the World Championships. The 4-time Crucible champ has also reached another 2 finals, including last year, and he's possibly the only player that I could watch lose every single match that he plays in a season and still struggle not to make him one of the favourites for the tournament, such as the enormity of the task that players face when trying to beat him over multiple sessions. Last year, I was super confident that he'd win his 5th title, and he was only a few frames away from getting me a small return on that gamble. But this year it's much harder to predict with Selby, Doubting him is a fool's game, and we know that even if he isn't at his best, he has the ability to drag players into a dogfight and play his sort of B game, C game, which is when he becomes sort of near impossible to beat. But I do just have sort of this feeling that if he comes up against someone who is feeling more confident in their game than Selby is in his, that player will be able to punish him. So, with Selby, I could never go lower than sort of a 7 out of 10. But I don't think I can go higher than that this year either. It's just that there's no form and a lack of confidence. And there's too many players in the draw that are playing well enough to possibly beat him if he's having an off day. So for me, Selby is a 7 out of 10. In at the 4th seed, we've got Mark Allen, and it took Mark a few tournaments for his season to really get going. But since then, he has again been one of the players of the season. Beating Trump 10-3 to win that Champion of Champions back in October of last year really kick-started his season, and he's gone on to win the Shootout and the Players' Championships. In addition to those wins, he's also got to the semi-finals of the Masters and the Tour Championships. I've mentioned a few times this season in videos how I personally can't understand the criticism that Mark sometimes faces for the changes that he's made to the way he plays the game. Becoming a more all-rounded player has turned him from someone who might win a title every couple of seasons to someone who now challenges for tournaments week in, week out. And perhaps one of the stats that highlights this change for the better is that run that he had last year to the semi-finals at the Crucible. That was the first time he got to the semi-finals at the Crucible since 2009. And between 2010 and 2023, Mark lost in the first round 4 times and the second round a further 6 times. But with his new style and his improved consistency, he turned up at Sheffield last year as a different animal. No longer the quick-fire break builder, but now a man who is willing to mix it and someone who you need to sort of scrape off the table. And that is typically a recipe that works very well for players who win a world championship. Like Ding, like Kyron Wilson, Allen is a player yet to get his hands on the famous trophy, but it is becoming more and more possible, and I would say plausible, that he might be the next first-time world champion. And again, for me, Allen will take some stopping, and I'd give him an 8 out of 10. The 3rd seed, Judd Trump, is one of the outstanding players of the season. And at risk of sounding a little bit like a broken record, this has just been an exceptional season from Judd Trump. For the 3rd time in his career, he has won 5 or more titles in a single campaign, and he's also reached another 3 finals. And I think what has been even more impressive is I can't really single out a particular match or a particular tournament where Judd has played at his absolute supreme best. But what he's done is he's become very, very good at finding a level that is good enough to win the majority of matches he plays. And when he's been challenged, more often than not, he's been able to find an extra gear when he needs to. And, the sky really is the limit for Judd. And I suppose the only thing really left for him is now, how many world titles can he pick up? 1 so far. Nothing is certain in sport, but I am fairly confident he won't finish his career with just a single Crucible win to his name. But when it comes to the World He made his debut in 2007, and then he really emerged himself on the world stage in 2011, qualifying for the Crucible just after winning his first ever tournament in China. And there he beat defending champion Robertson in the first round, beat Junhui on the semi-finals on his way to the final, where he just lost out to John Higgins. And since then he has won it, of course, in 2019, and he was runner-up again 2 years ago. He's also reached 2 more semi-finals and a further 4 quarter-finals at the World Championship. And he's only lost twice in the first rounds, losing to McLeod in 2017 and obviously McGill last season. And, of course, Judd, he's best known for his flair, for his potting, his cue power. But I still think, even now, that his all-round game is completely underappreciated. And he is more than capable of mixing it when he's needed to. You don't achieve what he's achieved through just potting and break building alone. If you're a Judd fan, you must be feeling very positive of your man. You must do, going on a very deep run over the next couple of weeks. There was a slight blip in his loss to Mark Williams where, he never really got going, and it was probably his worst performance of the season. And whilst some might argue that it's the worst time to start showing weakness from Judd, I personally only think that will have only sharpened him up to get him ready for a second world title bid. There'll be a big target on his back, of course there will be, but as he's shown this season, he doesn't usually wilt under that type of expectation, and for me, I'd be very surprised to not see him perform to a pretty high level. So for Judd Trump, and if I'm looking at out of 10, is he going to win the World Championship this season, he gets an 8.5. The second seed for this year's World Champion is the man, the myth, the legend, the one and only Ronnie OSullivan. And going from one player who's already won 5 titles this season, we go straight into another one. Now, the Rocket may have shared some opinions about the Crucible in the past few hours, which is an understatement to say I disagree with. But on the table, he has been nothing short of a delight this season. 5 trophies in the bag, as I say. And he is 2/3 of the way towards the season Triple Crown, something he has never achieved, and a feat only achieved in the past by Steve Davis, Stephen Hendry and Mark Williams. 17 days is all that stands between OSullivan and snooker perfection, and an amazing season could become something almost unthinkable. In a similar vein to Judd, there have been really very few occasions this season where Ronnie has played out of this world snooker. However, that fear factor he holds over the majority of the tour is still alive and well. And also, like Judd, he's had the ability to go up a gear when he senses danger. And of course, something that he's been good at his whole career is never shying away from a finish line. Instead, he always powers through it. And I think something that best demonstrates that this season is if we look at 3 best of 19 matches against Ding Junhui, Ali Carter and Gary Wilson. It was 7-all in all 3 of those matches, and in all 3 he just put together 3 unplayable frames on each of those occasions to get to the winning line. And then when it comes to World Championship calibre, very few in the history of the sport come remotely close to Ronnie. 7 times the Crucible King, losing only one other final to Selby a decade ago. And it was about 5 years ago when OSullivan seemed marooned on 5 titles, like he was destined never to win another one. And I was starting to have a belief that he would never win another one. But since then, he has made me eat my words and then some. I could go on and on and on about Ronnie, but the simple fact is he is on the verge of history. Not only can he complete the season Triple Crown, not only can he match his 8 UK titles and his 8 Masters titles, but a win in Sheffield will take him clear of Hendry, and that means there is not a single record in the sport that he would not hold. I've said for a while now that it seems kind of written in the stars that this storyline ends in history for the Rocket. If you were looking for reasons to go against him, I suppose the way that he lost 7 in a row in that final to Williams in the Tour Championships was a little reminiscent of how he lost 7 on the bounce last year in the quarterfinals to Luca Brecel. And it does go without saying that those patches of bad form just can't happen for a Crucible winner. you're going to have bad sessions. But as the old cliche says, can you get out of a bad session 4-all? Can you come out of it 5-3 behind? You can never afford to lose 7 frames under bounce. But, even if Ronnie will undoubtedly try and downplay it, we know how much he'll be gunning for that title. And with Steve Peters again in his corner, it's going to take some stopping and it's going to take some performance to beat him. And just simply because of that narrative of the script that could be written, it's a 9.5 for me. And now, last but not least, we have the top seed and defending champion Luca Brecel. Hard to believe it's 12 months since he claimed a maiden world title with one of the most astounding displays produced from a player at the Crucible. Kind of shades of 2011 Judd Trump for me. If we were to take a look at Luca's season, though, it's been a little underwhelming. And to be fair, this often is the case for first-time world champions, sort of suddenly feeling an extra spotlight on them. I remember Stuart Bingham having a similarly poor follow-up season after he stunned the world in 2015. But with that said, Luca has still reached 2 finals, both in invitational events in Shanghai and Saudi Arabia, losing both of them to Ronnie OSullivan. But in ranking events, he's just got 1 solitary quarter-final to his name. And, there have been flashes here and there recently that have suggested a return to his best might be forthcoming. And he has said in interviews recently, I think mainly coming out of the Saudi Arabia tournament, that, he's feeling good and positive again. But he hasn't quite delivered yet. And then if we look at Luca's sort of world championship record, his win last year is made even more remarkable by the fact that in his previous 5 Crucible appearances, he had not won a single match at the venue. And he had also lost 3 deciders. One of those, he was 7-2 up on Marco Fu and still managed to lose that one. And even looking back at last year's World Championship, his first round match against Walden went 9-9. And I think he was something like 9-7, 9-6 ahead. So, he showed immense bottle to get over the line there. And, I've always made a point about how important previous Crucible form is when looking at a world champion. And if I'd done this video a year ago, I would probably not have given Luca higher than maybe a 4. But, last year he just blew that theory out of the water. And getting that first win just propelled him through the rest of the tournament. Not only did he beat Mark Williams, Ronnie OSullivan and Mark Selby, who between them have 14 world titles, he also staged that just ridiculous comeback from 14-5 down in the semis to win 17-15. But there are 2 words that are going to be ringing in Luca's ears over the next few days, if they haven't been already. And those are the Crucible curse. No former first-time Crucible champion has ever defended their title. We've had 18 first-time Crucible champions before. All of them have been and gone, and none of them have managed to defend their crown. 5 of those losing in the first round, and only 2 have ever made it back to the final the following year. That is the kind of mountain that Luca Brecel has to climb. Only, in addition to that, only Stephen Hendry, Steve Davis, Ronnie OSullivan and Mark Selby have ever defended a world championship crown at the Crucible. So the stats do not lie in Luca's favour at all. But sometimes records are there to be broken. And, perhaps this is the year the curse ends. I was wrong to doubt Luca last year, and I could be again this year. But guys, the curse is real. We just have to accept it. The snooker gods will never allow a first-time world champion to defend it. And as harsh as this does seem, I have to give a 2 out of 10 simply because the snooker gods will not allow it to happen. So yeah, there we are guys. That's all 16 seeds at this year's World Championship reviewed in full and ranked in terms of how likely I think they are to win the World Championship this year. Now, as always, there's a bit of a caveat to videos like this, and that is I've made the video before the draw's been made. So players like OSullivan, like Trump, like Williams, like Allen, players that I've tipped quite heavily to be favourites to win this year's World Championship, it's conceivable that they could play someone like a Jack Lazowski, a Neil Robertson, a Hussein Fafai, a Stephen Maguire in the first round, and suddenly their chances might diminish slightly. It's all about that draw. Can you get a favourable one? Does the draw open up for you? So many questions to be answered. As always, let me know in the comments, who are you backing to win this year's World Championship? Do you agree with me? Do you think O'Sullivan's name is almost etched onto that trophy already? Or do you think, Judd could get a second? Do you think we could get another first-time world champion? Do you think maybe a qualifier could win it? We've not had a qualifier win since Shaun Murphy in 2005. And like I say, we've got some big hitters there as well. Potentially a Jack Lazowski and Neil Robertson. But yeah, a couple more days left until we find out who the 16 qualifiers will be. Then the draw's made on Thursday. I'll be back to review that draw and have a preview for the tournament. But as always, keep enjoying the snooker, and I'll catch you all next time.